It's basically a bowl of dark leafy greens. I go for kale, arugula, spinach. Those are my top 3 favorites. And then I'll douse it with extra virgin olive oil because some of the most valuable nutrients in those greens are only accessible to you when consumed in the presence of fat.
Yeah, I mean, these are garbage products. Like grapeseed oil is something that didn't exist up until a few years ago, and it is the result of some industrious winemaker actually realizing that they were throwing out the seeds of grapes. Grapeseed oil it's a byproduct of the winemaking industry, right? They were throwing out the seeds of grapes, but then somebody realized that you could press these seeds for oil and run them through all of these different processes, and you get this like dirt cheap cooking oil, and it's now a multi-million dollar business around the world. And I mean, for me, I think the most treacherous thing about these oils, because I don't like to fear monger. I think it's when we consume ultra processed foods that are stuffed with them, and also when we and I would say mostly when we consume fried foods, because when you go to a restaurant and you order anything that's been fried, you know, I think in the back of our heads, maybe we expect them to be changing out the oil between every dish, but restaurants have notoriously thin margins, especially these days, right? And so that oil sometimes isn't changed for days. And it's the constant heating and reheating and just the maintenance of these oils at extremely high temperatures that causes them to degrade and oxidize and generate various oxidative byproducts like certain aldehydes, which are toxic to our mitochondria. So, I mean, I know you talk about the value of metabolic health all the time. The source of metabolic health can be traced to the mitochondria, right? The like energy generating organelles in our cells. And so by consuming fried foods, you're literally, especially on a chronic basis, you're poisoning your mitochondria essentially. And that it traces all back to the fact that these oils can be so, they mutate and they become so damaged over that chronic heating and reheating that happens all the time in restaurants.
If people can't see my face when you said poisoning our mitochondria, I made the Macaulay Culkin face. And then I realized I'm making the Macaulay Culkin face. Shout out to Home Alone, everybody. But man, that is nuts. Have you talked with Dr. Kate Shanahan?
You know, I have not, but I really like her work. I know that she's been a whistleblower on these oils for some time now. So I have not had her on the show, but yeah, we're very much aligned.
It's already done.
Yeah.
I'm going to make that connection. You guys just remind me of each other as well. It's going to be a great conversation. One of the things that she shared was a series of biopsies done. One was like early part of the 1900s, and looking at what are our fat cells actually, what's in there, and finding that the makeup of a human fat cell was somewhere in the ballpark of about 2% of these PUFAs, right? These polyunsaturated fatty acids. But more recently, when biopsies have been done, looking at the constitution of human fat cells, now it's upwards of about 20 to even upwards of 30% polyunsaturated fats. Literally, the makeup of our cells is different. We're not even the same humans anymore. We're made up of different ingredients. And with these types of oils being so volatile and so pro-inflammatory, it's just, again, another reason why it's not just the fact that we're gaining so much weight as a society, but we're also so much sicker, you know? So now let me ask you about this other, which when I was a kid, I remember my grandfather had high blood pressure. Then he was given some orders on what he was supposed to eat by the doctor. And one of those things was to switch over to margarine. So let's talk about what is margarine. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up consuming margarine. I remember having the little yellow tubs in my fridge at all times because I grew up in a house. My mother in particular was very concerned that because she believed that she had heart disease in her family, would develop heart disease. And so she was very attuned to the marketing surrounding, food products and what we thought at the time about the relationship between dietary fats like saturated fat and cholesterol as it pertained to our cardiovascular health. So I grew up in a house that was very concerned about heart disease. And so, yeah, I was eating margarine all the time as a kid. Now, back then, margarines were composed of partially hydrogenated oils. So they would use soybean oil, corn oil, and they would partially hydrogenate these fats to make them behave more like saturated fat at room temperature. And add some artificial coloring, squirt it into a tub, and that was supposed to be your butter replacement. Now, thankfully, as of about 7 years ago at this point, we've banned partially hydrogenated fats. And this, a lot of people are confused: partially hydrogenated fats, fully hydrogenated fats. Fully hydrogenated fats are actually, they aren't as harmful as the partially hydrogenated fats. There's some confusion over that. What partially hydrogenated fats are trans fats, essentially. And there's no safe level of trans fat consumption. These are directly toxic to our cardiovascular systems. We know that higher levels of trans fat consumption is directly and powerfully associated with increased risk for cardiovascular disease and even for dementia, for Alzheimer's disease as well. Because the kinds of fat that we eat, I mean, as you mentioned, influence not just the fatty acids that we store in our adipose tissue, but our brains are made of fat. So the kinds of fats that we consume dictate on a moment-to-moment basis how well our brains function, the kinds of fats that our brains are constituted with. And so trans fats are definitely a major enemy. And just going back briefly to the grain and seed oils that we talked about earlier, just because the FDA has banned partially hydrogenated oils from appearing in our food supply, that doesn't mean that we don't have any trans fats anymore in our food supply. Trans fats are created again via the production process used to create these grain and seed oils, right? So trans fats, we're probably exposed on a per capita basis to a lower amount of them, but they still exist. And I think the problem with margarines even today is that they're comprised of these grain and seed oils that, they're just they're not very transparent about how they're produced. And so I don't know how what the production process is that these oils undergo prior to making it into these yellow tubs. I would be very skeptical that they're treated with the care that fatty acids as delicate as polyunsaturated fats ought to be treated with, that they're doing that. And so I tend to avoid margarine. And also, why use something like margarine when extra virgin olive oil, again, is so beneficial from from so many different angles? I mean, you could see, there's a hierarchy of evidence, right? Like extra virgin olive oil, we've seen in culture, we've seen in animal studies, we've seen observationally, we've seen with randomized control trials, actually is beneficial to human health. But it's these replacement oils that we've just had to accept because food marketers tell us that they're the best oils to use. Extra virgin olive oil, I think, is like, it tastes better than these synthetic margarines that you find on the market. Now, the question is it healthier than butter? I still think that butter is a great food. It's a nutrient-dense food. With a serving of butter, you get about 10% of retinol, which is vitamin A, preformed vitamin A, which is highly bioavailable. You also get compounds like butyrate, CLA, vitamin K2. In some people, butter will raise levels of LDL, which, isn't necessarily, depending on, your overall metabolic health, a bad thing. But some people might, want to reduce saturated fat in their diet, which is something that I understand. Everybody's different, so I don't prescribe a one-size-fits-all approach to diet. But in that case, the alternative to butter that I would recommend wouldn't be margarine. It would be extra virgin olive oil or something like avocado oil, which is also a great, has a really great fatty acid profile.
It's so good. You just brought up something about vitamin A that is really important. This is one of those nutrients that's highly correlated with longevity, but there are different forms of it, right? The plant form isn't the same thing.
Right.
And so just keeping that in mind in our back pocket, and also just looking at, really what I'm hearing is humans have been doing this for a long, long time. And we have a cold processing, a cold extraction method versus the high heating of these very volatile and sensitive oils that happen for these vegetable oils. So I really want to be able to put this to bed. And I remember, and this is true story, at that university, this was like about 17 years ago, maybe 18 years ago, I was showing people whenever a new client or a new, I'm doing a training program with some of these athletes, I would pass around this Kellogg's cereal bar that was my cereal bar that I thought was super healthy. And then I came across some data on partially hydrogenated vegetable oils. and the fact that they were about to be banned in New York City. I think this was around 2007 when they were officially banned, possibly.
Yes. Yeah.
And so this was prior to this. So this is maybe like a year earlier, a year and a half earlier. I was still sharing the data, and then once that article came out, I was showing everybody, as like, I told you, you're like, this is not good stuff. And so now here we are all these years later, when they finally kind of get out of circulation. And as you mentioned, I think it was about 7 years ago. But look how long these changes take, and look how long they were consumed by millions upon millions of people every single day.
Yeah.
And it was literally breaking down their bodies, their cardiovascular system. These were things that were promoted as healthy by dietitians, by our healthcare professionals. Because, and I want to ask you about this, because you mentioned with your mom, she was what we call health conscious.
Yeah.
She was very health conscious, but it was the belief system that was, there's an overarching intention of eating healthy things, but the marketing can manipulate our thinking rather than reality, in a sense. So can you talk a little bit about that, the idea of being health conscious versus partially hydrogenated vegetable oil?
Yeah, I mean, people who are health conscious are willing to spend, right? And so the food industry knows that, and so they're happy to exploit our anxieties and our fears about food. And so my mother was one of those characters, right? She was health conscious. She read. This was like before the internet, obviously. So thankfully now we have access to thought leaders in the space. People like you. We all have access to PubMed. There's this democratization of information that has occurred over the past 10, 20 years that prior generations really, they didn't have access to. They didn't have access to the kinds of information that we had now. And so they were much more vulnerable. Not to say that we're not vulnerable today. We certainly still are. But my mother read all the magazines, read all the newspapers, and the paradigm for health that she received was that dietary saturated fat, very harmful, dietary cholesterol, very harmful, refined grain products, because they were low in fat, benign, if not beneficial to her health. So I grew up in a household where, we ate lots of refined grain products. Generally, we ate low in cholesterol foods. We had, fat-free foods all around the house. I even grew up in a neighborhood in New York City where we had a supermarket that was called F3, fat-free foods. And
what?
It was just, yeah.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah, it was a supermarket. Everything, it was like a 99-cent store, but instead of everything being 99 cents, everything had to be fat-free or low-fat in this supermarket. Because back when I grew up, that was like, I was born in 1982, which thankfully, when I became sort of aware of my diet, we were just sort of getting out of that hysteria surrounding fat. But my mom was certainly influenced by it. And so growing up, I remember I was about 12 years old when I had my first egg, when my mom created made an omelet for me for the first time. We had margarine in the fridge, as I had mentioned. And these were all well-intentioned attempts at getting healthy, at being healthy. And so, I think it's a shame. I mean, my mom, this is public. She developed a form of dementia, which, she struggled with for years. My mother never ended up developing heart disease, but she ended up developing all of these other problems. The major problem that my family struggled with was the fact that she had a form of dementia. And, I would never be able to trace her health problems back to any singular food component, but I do know a lot about her dietary pattern over the years. And it was low in fat. It was largely devoid of animal products, very little dietary cholesterol, but full of these fake industrially produced fats and oils. And so, I can't say that those are the smoking gun, but as in sort of N of one anecdotal correlation, it's clear that dietary pattern didn't protect her. And it's been, a motivating force in my life to try to unravel and understand what it is, how we can eat to preserve and enhance our brain health and our cardiovascular health and our, metabolic health as we age.
Yeah, this is, again, one of the reasons you are who you are, man. You're invested in this in a different way because of the experience with your mom. And, again, that creates this perseverance in somebody that you just can't put into words.
Yeah. I mean, I've had the misfortune of seeing real illness, and insofar as we can influence our health with the choices that we make day to day, I mean, I think we ought to, right? Because chronic disease, it's like trying to get out of that. I mean, first of all, it's like anybody who's listening to this who's ever had a chronic illness knows that it's essentially the fog of war. You can't see which way is up. It's very hard to get, especially with a complex medical condition. Finding a diagnosis. I mean, that's like the first thing you want, but even that can provide a false sense of security because a diagnostic term doesn't say anything really about the root cause of a condition. And certainly when you have something like dementia, which takes years, if not decades, to manifest, like most chronic diseases, which people are struggling with, which kill 60% of people worldwide, according to the World Health Organization these days, right? Like, these are conditions that don't develop overnight. They take years of poor dietary and lifestyle habits to come to fruition. And so it can seem like a lot. It could seem like a big undertaking to take the reins of your own health, but I think it's so worth it. And the earlier you start, the better.
Yeah. Powerful. You mentioned in your experience growing up the refined grain products, again, because they're low fat. We've got these, the superior grains that we have available now. And then there was a shift, of course, to trying to do everything whole wheat and things of the like. Would that be on that list of foods that are propagated as healthy that are probably damaging to our metabolism?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think people are starting to wake up to the fact that most things that are refined are not great for you, but you still can walk through the aisles of a modern supermarket and see countless refined grain products that are marketed as being healthy, whether they are low in fat, low sodium, gluten-free, non-GMO, organic. There are numerous health terms that are planted on these products. The Red Heart Healthy logo, for example, is pervasive. If you look at, breakfast cereals, it would almost lead you to believe that heart disease is caused by a deficiency of morning oatmeal, when that's not the case. And so I think that this is a major problem. I mean, the thing about refined grains, there are a number of incriminating aspects to them, but we could talk about the fact that it becomes really easy to just consume a lot of what is essentially sugar after it these products pass your lips. The ensuing avalanche of blood sugar that occurs with just one that can occur with just a single bolus of a refined grain serving, whether it's your morning oatmeal or a commercial cereal or the like. Or it's the fact that these products take little to no effort for your body to digest and assimilate. There was a great chat that I had with a food scientist recently, and we were talking all about the fact that when you're consuming whole foods, there's actually a proportion of calories, and it varies from food item to food item, that don't get absorbed by you. And there was a study that was published it came out of the USDA of all places. And they found that when you eat whole nuts, meaning you have a handful of whole nuts, you chew them yourself. So this isn't nut butter. These are whole nuts. You chew them yourself. About 30% of the calories that you ingest actually don't get absorbed. You end up passing them because they can't get broken down and be assimilated in time before you expel them. So the same goes for most whole foods, but the problem with refined grains is that you absorb 100% of the calories that you consume when they're from these refined grain products. Refined grain products also tend to have a lot of added sugar. Your average American today consumes 66 pounds of added sugar per year, which is just a tremendous amount of sugar, and we have no dietary or biological need for added sugar of any sort. And also most of these products are devoid of any real nutrition, so they're essentially empty calories. Now, food manufacturers will tend to fortify these products using synthetic vitamins. I mean, if you pick up a loaf of commercial bread, usually you'll see niacin has been added, folic acid has been added. Our food
Enriched.
manufacturers enrich these refined grain products so that they're not completely devoid of any nutrition. But, we touched on beta carotene and vitamin A earlier. Folic acid is one example of a nutrient that a lot of people can't properly metabolize. They need to ingest folate, which is the natural form. Folic acid is always synthetic. And so do you really want to be ingesting synthetic nutrients? I mean, I'm not saying that these are going to harm you in any significant way, but refined grain products, yeah, they're just empty calories. And they're just, it's like they're one of the defining features of the standard American diet. Your average adult now consumes 60% of their calories from ultra-processed foods. Most of those foods are based on refined grains. And for children, it's even scary. I mean, I know you're a dad. Children, their consumption of ultra-processed foods make up something like 70 to 80% of their daily calorie intake. It's shocking.
For somebody that wants to upgrade themselves, what should they eat and not eat?
Yeah. So, opt for foods that are nutrient dense. One of the easiest things that I recommend that people can do every single day is to consume what I call a large fatty salad. I think it's one of the best ways to really check off so many of your nutritional boxes, to get an abundance of dietary fiber that the microbes that live in your large intestine love to consume. And when I say fatty, I don't mean, throwing on tortilla strips and cheese and ranch dressing. I mean, taking a bowl of dark leafy greens, kale, spinach, which are, top sources of magnesium, which 50% of people do not consume adequate amounts of, folate, arugula. Arugula is a top source of nitrates, dietary nitrate, really important in terms of increasing blood flow to the brain. One single high nitrate meal might actually improve cognitive function. It's that powerful. Dousing those dark leafy greens with extra virgin olive oil, which research has shown out of Barcelona, Spain, the PREDIMED study, you can consume about 1 liter a week to better cognitive function, cognitive health, cardiovascular health, and it might even help you lose weight because it's so anti-inflammatory. Actually, there's a compound in extra virgin olive oil that is as anti-inflammatory as low-dose Advil, but without any of the potential for negative side effects. And importantly, you need to have fat in that salad because fat allows many of the most important nutrients in the salad to become bioavailable. So I talk a lot about in this book, which I think is bringing, especially, there's a lot, I think actually that there's a lot of new information that I bring to the conversation, but I talk particularly about carotenoids and how research has shown out of University of Georgia that by eating lutein and zeaxanthin, by supplementing with these carotenoids, you can actually boost visual processing speed by 20%, even if you're young and healthy. So, I mean, these are young and healthy people that are already considered to be at the peak of their cognitive prowess. Visual processing speed is so important. I mean, think about it in terms of responding to visual stimuli, driving, athletic performance, sports performance, things like that.
Video games.
Video games.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, dark leafy greens are abundant in these two carotenoids, and they're only absorbed through the digestive tract when in the presence of fat. You don't absorb any of them unless you're consuming them with fat. So like that fat-free dressing, throw that in the trash. Extra virgin olive oil, is super key. Eating a large fatty salad, I think is just really key. People tend to think about salads in terms of like weight loss. I want to lose weight, I'm going to eat more salad. But really in terms of the brain, it's powerful. You also get the benefit of, I mentioned dietary fiber. We now know that you have microbes that live in your large intestine that when you consume fermentable, soluble prebiotic fiber, which is found in abundance in that bowl of greens, the microbes churn out a compound called butyrate, which is profoundly anti-inflammatory. It is really beneficial in terms of the gut ecosystem. It's been shown to boost levels of growth factors in the brain, which promote neuroplasticity, which is your brain's ability to change over time. Very important stuff. In terms of lifestyle, I advise, as I mentioned, not eating for an hour or two after you wake up. People today are really obsessed with intermittent fasting, which I think is, really great. At the very least, it I think has awakened people to the necessity to bring back balance in terms of being fed and being fasted. But I don't get hung up over the hours. I think it's just really important to honor the body's natural circadian inclinations. You really want to, after that 1, 2, or 3 hour window, eat your food, and then stop eating for 2 to 3 hours before bed. Again, we talked about the glymphatic system. It's a newly discovered system, but it's been theorized that eating soon before bed might interfere with that cleanup process. And then, I try to eat a low carb diet. I try to avoid dense sources of carbohydrate, with the exception of occasionally eating them in the post-workout window. If you're going to eat carbs throughout the day, you really want to concentrate them into one meal. It seems that when you consume your carbs concentrated into one meal, less insulin is required to clear those carbs from circulation, that glucose from circulation, as opposed to if you were to spread them out over the course of the day, which makes that old advice to eat 6 small meals throughout the day particularly bad, because insulin seems to be able to compound on itself. So rather than eating, 30 grams of carbs at lunch, 30 grams of carbs at dinner, 30 grams of carbs at breakfast, concentrate them into one meal, and there's less of an insulin AUC, so less insulin being stimulated to clear that glucose, which is important because, as we talked about earlier, glucose is very damaging when it's in the blood. It glycates those proteins.
That is really interesting. Everything you've said is really interesting.
I mean, yeah, I'm a major nerd for this kind of stuff. Whether or not you're concerned about your risk for disease in the long term, all these things actually help you feel great in the here and now. We talked about visual processing speed, just in terms of your overall energy levels, feeling less beholden to your hormones and to your, food cravings, I think is really important. And these are all ways of really kind of, I think, helping stack the odds in our favor, because when it comes to nutrition, what I've found is that the mainstream medical system has very little to offer. And nutrition really is so important when it comes to preventing, all of the diseases that I think we're seeing skyrocket today. I mean, according to the World Health Organization, chronic diseases now account for 60% of deaths worldwide.
Wow, that's incredible. All right, before I ask my last question, what's the best place for people to find you online?
Definitely Instagram. I'm pretty active on Instagram. People can go to my website and join my newsletter, which I put a lot of time into. Genius Foods really is, I think, I've been able to synthesize, much of, if not all of what I've learned into the book.
Amazing. So my final question, if people are only going to make one single change in their life to have the biggest impact, what change should they make?
Man, that's a good question. We've already talked about nutrition, so I'm going to throw you a curveball, and I'm going to say I think that people really should be kind to one another. I think that's so important. Teach one another to help, be a shoulder for others, especially that are less fortunate, to give back, whether it's charity, whether it's just to be more diligent and deliberate about your social media use by posting things that are less inflammatory, more helpful. When I see suffering, I'm profoundly affected by it, and there's a lot of suffering going on in the world, both in terms of health, food scarcity, things like that. So just, do your part.
In your book, you talk about how to improve cognition, how to improve the health of your brain, how to prevent disease. I have a very simple question for you. What is a great, simple, brain-boosting breakfast? Like, what should someone start their day with to improve their brain health and improve the way that they think throughout the day?
Really good question. So, the first thing that I do when I wake up is I'll drink a glass of water, usually with a little bit of mineral salt in it. If I'm doing a particularly low-carb iteration of my diet, I become really conscious of getting enough electrolytes, and that includes sodium. Sodium's a nutrient. It's been sort of demonized over the past couple of decades in this country.
Wait, so sodium's not bad?
Sodium's not bad. No, it's actually called a macro mineral because we actually require a relatively large amount of it for good health. And today, our products actually label themselves as being low sodium as if it's a good thing, but that's sort of I think, tending to the wrong issue, because so often these processed foods, which have been stripped of sodium, it's the processed foods that are bad for us. But anyway, so when you're doing a low carb diet, essentially what you're doing is you're stimulating less insulin, because carbohydrates are the most insulin stimulating of the macronutrients. And when you have less circulating insulin, your kidneys basically spill sodium. And you need sodium to feel good, to keep your blood pressure up. In fact, having clinically low sodium is actually something called hyponatremia, and it can manifest as symptoms of dementia, which is
very dangerous.
Very dangerous.
Now, is this why when people do low carbohydrate diets or ketogenic diets, sometimes they experience muscle cramps?
Yes, potentially. And also, it's thought that it could also contribute to the low carb flu that so many people frequently have. Yeah.
So it's not what we've heard, where it's like, oh, I can't switch into ketosis. It's, hey man, you need more sodium.
Yeah, you need more sodium. You got to add more salt to your diet if you're doing a very low carb diet.
Okay.
And your first day on a low carb diet, you basically cut the amount of insulin that your pancreas is secreting by half. So add some more salt. When I'm doing low carb, I sprinkle it in my water, and it's actually one of the more impactful things that I do. I feel really good when I'm doing it. I feel more alert.
What's a good mineral salt? Is pink Himalayan salt a good option?
I get my salt from a company in Utah called Redmond Real Salt. I have zero financial affiliation with them.
Okay.
I'm just a fan of the product.
You're the third person that's told me about real salt.
Yeah, it's good.
So I think I'm going to go there too.
It tastes good. It's pink. It's got other minerals in it. It's from an underground dehydrated lake. I'm like promoting their product now. And it's very clean. It's got trace iodine, stuff like that.
Okay, so you start with a little bit of a pinch of that salt in your water. What else? What should someone eat next?
Yeah, so then about an hour or two after I wake up, I don't eat immediately after waking up. I think, growing up I was told that breakfast was the most important meal of the day. But the thing is, when you wake up first thing in the morning, your body has a hormonal milieu that wants to burn through stored fuels. Cortisol, which is the body's chief catabolic hormone, is at its peak about 45 minutes after you wake up. And what that hormone is doing, it's working to liberate stored fats, sugars, and things like that your brain and muscles want to use for fuel. It's basically the body's chief waking hormone, although today it's been sort of bastardized and tied to chronic stress, which has become very prevalent in the modern world. But you don't want to mess with cortisol. You want cortisol to do its job. And so frequently, especially in the most commonly consumed form of breakfast, the muffin or the cereal.
Captain Crunch,
what we're doing, think about how insane this sounds from an evolutionary standpoint, that in the modern world, when cortisol is elevated, that it's going to be the highest that it is throughout the day, we're also elevating with our high carb breakfasts insulin, which is the body's chief anabolic hormone. So having cortisol elevated and insulin elevated when we have our typical high carb breakfast, that's like a recipe for disaster. Actually, what that does is it helps redistribute your body weight from muscle to fat. Because when insulin is elevated, cortisol will continue to exert its catabolic effect.
Interesting.
But because insulin creates sort of like a one-way valve on your fat cells, it only exerts that effect on your muscles. So
now you're catabolic muscle, anabolic fat.
No bueno.
Terrible combination.
Yeah, terrible combination.
So how long should you wait then before you eat?
An hour or two.
Okay.
Sometimes I'll wait 3. It's not, I don't get tied up over the hours, but I don't eat as soon as I wake up. I let cortisol do its job.
So then you avoid the refined carbohydrates, and should you eat like a high-fat breakfast?
Yeah, so what I often end up eating is I'll eat what I call a huge fatty salad. And I don't mean throwing ranch dressing on it, tortilla strips and cheese. I know. It's basically a bowl of dark leafy greens. I go for kale, arugula, spinach. Those are my top 3 favorites. And then I'll douse it with extra virgin olive oil, because some of the most valuable nutrients in those greens are only accessible to you when consumed in the presence of fat.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, fat sort of serves as like a slip and slide for those nutrients to get into your circulation, whereas without fat, their absorption is negligible. So I douse it with extra virgin olive oil. I'm getting lots of good prebiotic fiber with that salad, which helps to feed the microbes that live in the large intestine. So sometimes maybe I'll drink a bottle of kombucha with it. When you consume prebiotics with probiotics, it's been suggested that helps the probiotic bacteria help them better take up residence in the gut by sort of activating their metabolism. It's called symbiotics. Protein, definitely chicken. So I'll add, chicken or an egg to it, maybe some grass-fed steak. Protein is the most satiating macronutrient. It's really interesting. We didn't get to talk about this on the podcast, but there's this idea. It's called the protein leverage hypothesis, that basically states that our hunger mechanism is driven by protein, because protein is sort of the most valuable macronutrient. It was the hardest to get. We had to chase our food for the vast majority of our evolution. So we basically eat to get protein, essentially. And when you consume adequate protein, that's why it's more satiating than carbohydrates.
Because it sends a signal to your body, hey, you've got a lot of nutrients. And a lot of people don't realize this, but protein, obviously found a lot of it in meat. Meat is extremely nutrient dense. In fact, you'll get almost every nutrient you need from meat. So it just makes sense that you eat the protein, your body's like, cool, we got what we need.
Exactly.
Don't need to make you hungry.
Exactly. Yeah, so that's usually my first meal of the day. I make it a huge fatty salad, and that's a rule that I try to have for myself every single day. I try to eat a huge fatty salad every single day, because research shows out of Rush University that people that consume a large salad of dark leafy greens every single day have brains that look on scans 11 years younger.
Wow, that's fascinating. Now, here's something that I always talk about with people. Whenever I recommend something like that for breakfast, they always look at me and like, well, that's not a breakfast food. and this is a very interesting thing to touch on. Now, a lot of the things that we regard as breakfast, lunch, and dinner foods, those foods were decided for you by food manufacturers. So this was all, there is no such thing as a breakfast food. It really doesn't matter. You can eat whatever you want in the morning or whatever you want at night or in the afternoon. So having a salad in the morning, as weird as that sounds, you just have to decondition your, that conditioning that you've gotten from all those food manufacturers that have literally convinced you that cereal, muffins, waffles, and pancakes are breakfast foods. Those are actually, they're just foods, and they probably should be never foods, is what I like to call them.
Yeah, most breakfast foods commonly consumed in the U.S. are not foods, but they're food-like products.
Yeah.
To quote Michael Pollan. And but I also love eggs. So sometimes I'll go for some eggs with avocado and a little bit of like smoked salmon on the side.
So let me tell you what I like to eat. You give me a grade.
Okay.
So I'll wake up in the morning. I'll have a little. I'll wait about 45 minutes, and then I'll have a little bit of coffee, and then I'll eat. It's my favorite breakfast, by the way. Sardines, avocado, and some greens and olive oil. How does that sound?
I love that. That sounds amazing.
Is that good?
Yeah, actually, in my book, I just mix avocado with some sardines, and I call it a better brain bowl.
Oh,
yeah,
excellent.
It's literally, it's got everything you need. You've got your sardines, which, sardines are amazing. I had to convince myself to try them. There was a bit of a hump that I had to get over.
I think people confuse them with anchovies. They're not anchovies. They're actually really good.
They're really good. Well, I like anchovies too, actually. I do like and you should too. You're Italian, right?
I do like anchovies.
Anchovies are great.
But those are the salty, fishy fish.
Right.
Sardines don't taste like that. They're totally different.
They're meaty. Yeah, they taste really good, and they're packed with DHA fat, selenium, protein.
They're also extremely low in heavy metals because
very low in heavy metals.
Yeah, they're not a big fish like tuna, where if you eat a lot of tuna, you might cause accumulation of heavy metals. Sardines very low.
Yeah, and also very underappreciated. They're cheap and they're ultra portable. So I actually travel. I keep cans of sardines in my backpack.
Excellent. I love meeting other people who like sardines.
Same.
Excellent. So check it out. Share this video with your friends. I hope this made an impact on you. Now you know what to eat in the morning if you want to be smart. Look, if you have any questions, put it in the comments below. We'll go down there, try and answer those for you. Subscribe to this channel. We post new videos all the time. Also, there's a link underneath for Max's book, Genius Foods. Highly recommend you take a look at it.
But then you take a wild plant, like the kinds of plants that you described, yacon, maca. Those are plants with vigor, right? Like those are plants that are still having to fight for their own survival. Yeah. And then we pluck those plants, or we pick them, or what have you, and we ingest them. And what I love about this is that they impart that vigor unto you.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, listen, teed up, which is why I fell in love with Barukas, is because of that very thing. We were able to actually, we talk about maca, yacon, sashayinchi. Those are now being grown, and then grown in careful ways. And many of the superfoods are now doing that in some sort of farming method, and hopefully a diversification of that utilization of different plants contributing to the soil buildup rather than the stripping of. Whereas that's where I fell in love with Barukas. This was literally, and still is, a wild food. This is in a landmass that's almost half of the United States in its landmass, but we are collecting that which falls at the time that it needs to fall, giving the full nutrients and the strength of the Cerrado, which is 9 months, 8 to 9 months, no rain, and then monsoons. And so the strength and the antioxidants and the compounds that are there for its survival, which the great synergy between us and the plants is that we get to utilize and we get to benefit from these compounds that are protecting the plants, but then they're also weirdly protecting us. And we get to use that upregulation. And so that's why Barukas came this perfect kind of scenario where we could support the people, get a wild food out to people, because that wild nutrients into bodies is a really good idea, right? One of the most nutrient dense nuts in the world by us testing them. And then those indigenous people, we have over 2,000 collectors in the Cerrado, like, so supplying consistent jobs in areas that they need to have a job. So all of that wrapped itself up into this little, Baruka nut where people love it. It just so happens that the taste of it is just kind of blows you away and how good it is. But that is a spokesperson for what I was just describing. That is a wild food supporting a wild area. Plus, the last thing we did because of the deforestation, and you realize that why I'm talking about regeneration from a holistic standpoint, is we can no longer afford on any level as business owners to not look through the lens of how every aspect of our business is supporting or not supporting people, the planet, etc. So with us, we were seeing the deforestation literally driving through the Cerrado, being deforested faster than any landmass on the planet, which blows you away right there. You can't even get your head around it. Crying 2 times. I just broke down crying. Like, it was literally life and then stripped, just like right in your face. And it's like without any concern, with obviously unsustainable animal agriculture and food for those animals. So that was just radical. And then we're like, okay, well, let's put a goal. Let's try to plant 20 million freaking trees because they're being wiped out. So anyway, that encompasses a lot of what I was talking about.
Yeah, and I love Barukas. We've talked about them in the past on this show. I'm a huge fan, and actually, Barukas, we have a discount code for the audience if they'd love to go and if they like to go and check them out. Barukas.com. You can use code Genius15 for 15% off, which is a nut that you, I think, single-handedly brought to market in the U.S.
Well, our shared, we never do anything alone, that's for sure. But between a Brazilian, Rodrigo, and a team of people, like at first I was like, Rodrigo put some time and energy into it. And I was like, well, let's promote it and get you some of your money back, because I was so busy at the time. But then the more we studied, the more we looked at it, I couldn't let that go. And the more we interviewed people, like, I don't mean interview like a formal interview, but went around the country and had, all of this investigation into understanding the ecology, understanding the biology of the seed, but also the importance of this tree in the wild. Once you and then of course you meet the people, and honestly, how do you turn your back on that? So, knowing that the customer is going to radically benefit, knowing that people don't have much of a choice, and knowing that nut not only was not in the US, it wasn't doing well in the country itself. And it was actually, and I'm not even joking, it was going away.
Wow.
Like, they couldn't even afford to harvest and collect and distribute the Barukas in their own country. So we, at the last week, this guy was shutting his manufacturing door. We bought that facility and then revitalized this whole industry again. And so And now we've got other contributors and competitors. You're like, okay, cool.
That's great.
Yeah.
And it's a nutrient powerhouse. So, I mean, what a shame that would be, right? I mean, in a world where poverty and hunger are still so prevalent, to lose such a resource would be, I mean, what a shame that would be.
Well, I mean, that's my point of view, Max. I mean, every time you see these things, and again, like when I see these on the shelves, and I know that there's some good companies out there doing good things, and they're getting better and better, but there's also some horrible companies out there, just they're not even looking under the hood, and some of it's naivete. Like you expect, you get this white piece of paper of, the standard things that were tested and all that stuff, but it doesn't mean much, right? Especially when we're talking about the whole chain of custody of all of these things and how it's done. So yeah, I mean, we as a global society need to not only thrive in the vulnerability of opening our mouth, but also not, take empty foods in that have a whole slew of consequences as a result, and also take nutrient density in that's going to obviously upregulate and create strength in our bodies and our brains and our immune systems. I don't know about you, but that makes sense to me.
Yeah, me too. I want to talk about some specific superfoods and their benefits. But before we get to that, I want to tease out something that you mentioned earlier in our discussion about how you're not just what you eat, you're what your microbiota consume, and how a lot of these superfoods, they're beneficial in an indirect, but nonetheless still very significant way. It's via metabolites and various chemicals produced by these microbiota when they ferment the compounds contained in these plants. Mm-hmm. And how you're ingesting something that you ultimately will end up ingesting something else entirely. It reminds me of, I wrote about this in Genius Foods, the fact that, if you eat a very high fiber meal, say you eat a very low fat, high fiber meal, thanks to your microbiota, that actually could end up being a high fat meal, because what does fiber get metabolized to? Short chain fatty acids. So it's just this interesting link. I'd love if you could just go into that, and also how to optimize the microbiome to extract maximum nutrition from our food.
Yeah, well, there's so much ongoing data with all of this stuff, and that is, I've leaned on researchers that I've known. One guy kind of keeps his head down, Dr. Mohsen Hermanish, back in 20 years ago. He was like, diversification. So you go about simplistically saying diversification of fibers and colors and everything else is a really good plan, right? So, and now we're realizing that those colors, actually, some of them can actually be that which you're talking about, feeding that microflora, that microbiome, and actually upregulating and creating a whole cascade of effects, not only antioxidants, but serotonin and dopamine, and balance within that. And, and then you have all of these things of the sweeping things of how important stress is, or keeping stress down. And one little quick hack that keeps cortisol down, because that shuts down the microbiome, almost similar to I'm making a stretch, but it's a comparison nonetheless, which is when you consume alcohol of any kind, the body sees it as a poison, and it can absolutely shut metabolic processes down, similar to cortisol, right? So cortisol and that sympathetic response can shut down and change that microbiome, especially when you're living in that from a chronic perspective. So there's so many different inputs, but and that's why when anyone's changing anything in their diet, that you need to take steps, and you need to also, when you're coming off of something and when you're going into something, people underestimate how important that is, because it's the very thing that we're talking about. One person can be receiving nutrients while the other person isn't even able to. right? So we've gotten into such a macro view and simplistic reductionism as it comes to nutrition. It's just so much more complex than that. So I go back to listen, I'm a big fan of fiber, diversification of fibers and colors and all of that stuff. Now more than ever, that's what I would walk into more than anything else. And then stress, deal with stress. And then, like I said, like these other topics I'm getting into because of fatal convenience, we're realizing that, and I'll just say this, for example, bisphenol A, which shows up in canned products and water bottles and plastic that's wrapped in food, that one compound alone is a hormone disruptor. Right? So it binds to estrogen receptors. So the body feels like it's got more estrogen. For men, it actually slows down and stops testosterone. And it also does this other thing. There's a compound in food called, and I can get into this more, but it's called osmotin. And it's in every food in small amounts, but it turns on what's called adiponectin. And adiponectin, when you have a high amount of adiponectin in your body, it can literally start down-regulating all inflammation. It's very connected. Everyone can look this up right now. Adiponectin connected to dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, all of that stuff. So literally, this one compound, and we're only talking about 3 mechanisms here. We're talking about estrogen dominance. We're talking about testosterone plummeting. And we're talking about the disruption and the shutting off of this adiponectin, which is a body healer of magnitude in the body. So that's one chemical. At the same time, all of that metabolically, it's doing this other thing. It's shutting down leptin, right? So now that's intimately connected to your leptin. It's a term called I forget the term. There's a certain fat term that they're calling that, but it's now connected to. We can do all the thing. And listen, you and I have dedicated our lives to nutrition, right? And doing things that are optimizing nutrition. But at the same time, the chemicals in the park are in the parking lot doing push-ups against our own metabolic hormone brain processes that are literally taking off and flying towards heart disease, diabetes, motility, reproduction, 200 chemicals. And this was like a decade ago. 200 chemicals are in the umbilical cord of every American woman upon birth of their children. So I can't even get around this conversation anymore, because if we are going to talk about health, we also have to look at all the things in our modern day world that's literally feels like it's going exactly the opposite and what we need for our own health. So, and that's just one chemical, right? One of, this is going to sound freaky, 60 to 90,000 chemicals that are created every year, of which maybe 10% are studied at all.
Wow.
Maybe. So that anyway, I've been focused a lot on that stuff because it's, it came about. My father in the 90s had chemical sensitivity disorder. And so when we would go around my father, we couldn't wear the normal deodorants that smelled, laundry detergents, all of this stuff, because he was, we're recording this on Veterans Day. He was a veteran that worked on atomic bombs. It was called the Keeper of, he was one of a small group of people called the Keeper of the Dragon, which is a freaky name when you think about it for an atomic bomb, obviously. And his thyroid was annihilated, right? So it set him on a course. He couldn't deal. We all shouldn't be dealing with this, but he couldn't deal with the excess of chemicals that were hitting his body, and therefore had this chemical sensitivity, and therefore in the 90s started educating me and my family on all of the undercutting that this chemical soup that we've been creating in all of our, I mean, do you know that there's fire retardants in televisions?
It's insane. It's insane. No, we're being bombarded. It's like the Hunger Games.
It's beyond.
For the average person, thrust into battle unwittingly. with defenseless, right? Defenseless and blindfolded,
Totally.
because these chemicals, they're invisible, they're everywhere, and they're just, you can't avoid them at this point.
There's a great lot that you can do to counteract. I mean, there's certainly more and more companies creating better alternatives, and you can do a lot to mitigate this exposure, for sure. But to get rid of it completely, it's like, no, we got to make bigger swings to get industry to change. Which I also, getting in the position of people kind of coming at me from an environmental perspective and other solutions. I'm starting to see big companies taking some big swings at changing these industries. And it's exciting, and like plastic alone is such a monumental issue from so many different chemicals and exposures that there's this great company called footprintus.com, and they're working with Cargill, McDonald's, Pepsi. They're literally Walmart. They literally created plant-based fibers, waste products, and created alternatives to single-use plastic, right? So there are companies doing it. And so there is hope, always hope, and there's always a solution. But some of these things are proliferated in the society. And, one thing, stepping all the way back to maca, we were one of the first people to realize that maca, which is literally 10,000 feet plus in the Andes with nothing else around, was being inundated with heavy metals from illegal mining operations all throughout the Andes. So you're like, holy shit, like nothing's safe. So the naivete of testing any product, you have to test all your products for a handful of a growing list of chemicals that are permeating in our environment, just to be responsible to, as business owners, to be able to put things out there. So it's crazy.
Yeah, I'd like to blow the whistle on what I think is a massive scam, and that is BPA free. If you're consuming anything out of something that says BPA free, but it's plastic, there are other bisphenols in that product. We need to make a call to manufacturers to remove all bisphenols.
Yes,
and to state bisphenol free. I want to start seeing that on plastic bottles and cans.
I'm really happy you brought that up, because it's just literally the whole chemical industry is just going, hey, what's the chemical that we're getting pressured on? So then we'll just divert around it, create BPA, BPA-E, BPA, BP, like there's all different. And by the way, it now is turning out that these alternatives to the BPA is actually infinitely worse. So we think we're winning, but with the very, very poor regulations that aren't being regulated at all. Like, this is the crazy thing, Max, is that as I'm researching so much of this for the book, I realized that these agencies are just not performing. I've read articles where the FDA calls out a certain, could be propylene glycol, or it could be in the clothing industry, formaldehyde. And even these watch groups are calling it out, yet they don't do anything about it. Teflon and dental floss, for example, like it was even ported and Glide dental floss got slammed, and it's still there. Like, so I don't get it. Like, how is it that we have EPA, USDA, FDA, FCC, you name it, and yet they're completely failing at their job because this is not being regulated in a way. So then what happens to happen? I got to write a book on it. The food babe has to create her whole career on things that are showing up in the food that absolutely should never be consumed under any circumstances whatsoever in any amount. The fact that we have this in our society is a complete and utter fail at our society, which is then just poking the bear at when are we going to get the idea that profits over nature and health is a good idea.
My goal really is to make these kinds of principles actionable and approachable for people of all ages, especially younger people all around the globe. That's my mission, that's my life's work, and so I'm glad to be here to kind of give you guys a bit of a Cliff's Notes foray into my findings. As was mentioned, my mom at a very young age started to develop the earliest symptoms of dementia. I had no prior family history of any kind of neurodegenerative disease, so it caught me and my family completely off guard. It was traumatic, as you guys can imagine. And with no prior family history of dementia, I was at a loss. I couldn't explain it. So as somebody who's perennially curious and optimistic and resilient in the face of trauma, I began to roll up my sleeves and do the research for myself, because I was met with abject disappointment in every clinician's office that I had the privilege to be in with my mom. So because I had no prior family history of any kind of dementia, I began to ask myself what it was about my mother's environment that may have pulled the trigger on a genetic weakness in her that led to her being the first person in my lineage to develop dementia. I started to look at parts of the world where they have Alzheimer's risk genes, just like we do here. About 1 in 4 of us sitting in this room have a gene that puts us at higher risk for developing Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative conditions. But interestingly, in other parts of the world, like in Ibadan, Nigeria, that same genetic risk factor is associated with little to no increased risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. So just to put that another way, to rephrase that so you guys truly understand it, if you are genetically at risk for developing Alzheimer's disease in the United States, you might simply move to Ibadan, Nigeria, and see that risk abolished. That's kind of amazing, right? So I started to think about what our ancestral diet might have been like. You know, the kind of diet that human beings might have consumed during the time in which our magnificent brains evolved, right? I mean, certainly our environment has become a lot different, but we ate for millennia, and our diets and our lifestyles led to the evolution of the flagship product of Darwinian evolution, as I like to call it, the human brain, which each one of us is heir to, this magnificent supercomputer. But about 10,000 years ago, we reached a turning point in our evolution where, after millennia of growing, our brains actually began to shrink, ultimately losing the volumetric equivalent of a tennis ball. So just to put that another way, so you really get to understand it viscerally, we ate for a certain way for hundreds of thousands of years that led to the growth and development of the modern human brain, and then we turned our backs on that diet, and our brains began to shrink. We became settlers. We went from being hunter-gatherers to being domesticated by the handful of crops and animals that we could cultivate. And that paved the way for the fact that today, our diets are composed primarily of calories from just 3 plants. Can anybody guess what those plants are? We've got 2 of them. One more, last one I haven't heard. Not soy, rice. Yes. So today, 60% of the calories that we consume come from just 3 plants: wheat, corn, and rice. And not only that, but these plants are usually pulverized and processed and ground into a dust to form the ultra-processed foods that we now eat with abandon. It doesn't help that our dietary guidelines advise us to consume these kinds of foods at every single meal. We're told to load up on healthy whole grains. Well, recently, Cochrane, which is known for their unbiased systematic reviews in partnership with the World Health Organization, found that there was actually never any good evidence that grain consumption benefits heart health beyond just epidemiological studies that show that populations that eat higher amounts of whole grains tend to have better health. But there we can look to something called the healthy user bias. People who eat highfalutin grains like quinoa and brown rice, they tend to do other healthy things in their diets and lifestyles as well. But when we look at randomized controlled trials, which are the kinds of trials that can prove cause and effect, which this meta-analysis actually chose to look at, they found that there's insufficient evidence from randomized controlled trials to date to recommend the consumption of whole grain diets to reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease. And of all the researchers that I've spoken to about what causes Alzheimer's disease, it seems that vascular dysfunction of the network of blood vessels that feed your brain nutrients and oxygen, may be one of the earliest things to go awry in the body. Now, as I mentioned, these grains are packaged and sold to us in our supermarket aisles. Many of these packaged products make health claims, right? They compel you to want to buy them because they've got that beautiful red heart usually on the box, right? These foods now make up 60% of the calories that we consume worldwide, ultra-processed foods. These foods are dangerous for a number of reasons. I'm going to tell you guys why. Before we get to that, this is one family's food consumption for a week. Yeah, this is highly problematic. See, what these foods do is they drive a process in the body called inflammation. Has anybody heard of inflammation? Yeah, so inflammation is like having a forest fire in the body. It's actually meant to occur, like those Tide spot cleaning wipes when you get a stain on a piece of clothing? Inflammation is naturally meant to spot clean cuts, wounds, bruises, and things like that. But the problem is that our immune systems are responding to the fact that our diets, that there's this predominance of ultra-processed foods in our diets. And so now we have widespread chronic inflammation in our bodies. It's like a forest fire. It's the equivalent of a forest fire in our bodies. And our brains sit directly downwind of that fire. Now, our bodies are incredible, right? Like, we didn't make it here through millennia to be taken down by this process necessarily. We have an ability to repair from the damage wrought by inflammation. But the problem is our bodies need the appropriate ingredients to be able to do that efficiently. Now, going back to these ultra-processed foods, if you look on the backs of most of the packages of them, you'll find that they're all fortified with synthetic vitamins. And that's because these foods are nutrient deficient. And it's the reason why, the fact that our diets are based on these foods, 90% of Americans are now deficient in at least one essential nutrient. So even though our bodies have the ability to defend against chronic inflammation, or at least acute inflammation, we're seriously handicapping our bodies in profound ways. And so it's causing this damage to our bodies and ultimately to our brains. These foods also drive the chronic elevation of a hormone in our bodies called insulin. Now, insulin is not bad, but when it's chronically elevated, it drives the storage of fat. And many people today are overweight or obese. In fact, 2/3 of US adults are either overweight or obese. For the first time in human history, there are more overweight adults than there are underweight. Now, the problem when we consume these kinds of foods, again, the packaged processed foods made of ground up rice, wheat, and corn, and these kinds of foods, is that they cause our fat cells to become sort of like a subway turnstile at rush hour in Midtown Manhattan. Calories can flow in, but they can't come out. And this is problematic because our brains love to use fat for fuel, but we're basically blocking our brain's abilities to use fat for fuel because we're always eating these high carbohydrate, ultra packaged processed foods. Now, when a baby is developing, A baby's brain loves to use fat for fuel. In fact, mother's milk is full of a type of fat called medium-chain triglycerides, which turn into ketones in the body. Has anybody heard of ketones? They're kind of trendy right now because a lot of people are on these ketogenic diets. Halle Berry, I've discovered, is on a ketogenic diet. The Kardashians are on ketogenic diets. Very few people actually know what ketogenic diets are, but they basically supply fat to the brain. The brain loves to use fat as a fuel source. But the inhibition of fat metabolism by high carbohydrate diets may actually be one of the most detrimental aspects of modern diets. And part of this has to do with the fact that the brain's ability to use fat is shunted by chronically elevated insulin. Chronically elevated insulin is problematic for many reasons. It's pro-inflammatory. And published in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease, it was suggested that 40% of Alzheimer's cases alone may be attributable to chronically elevated insulin. So, for the next few slides, for the remainder of my talk, I'm going to give you guys an antidote to the standard American brain-shrinking diet by telling you the foods that you should actually be eating every single day. I call these foods the genius foods. Now, genius foods is not a scientific term. It's sort of like superfoods. But I thought that if I could get people to think about the foods that are most beneficial to the brain, well, then you're going to be able to choose these foods at every meal and maybe kind of elbow out the foods that are less supportive of optimal brain function and brain health. So for one, we've got dark leafy greens, like kale. You should actually write these down. I see some people taking notes. I'm going to go over the 10 genius foods plus one bonus food. So you're going to get 11 foods. You should write these down because they're all very beneficial in different ways. So we've got dark leafy greens. Research out of Rush University has found that people who consume a large bowl of dark leafy greens every single day have brains that tend to perform up to 11 years younger. Okay? So what you want to do every day, a rule that I lay out in my book and in my work, is that you should try to have a big salad every day. Easy, right? Try to fill it with dark leafy greens like kale, spinach, and arugula. Kale is actually very high in two compounds called lutein and zeaxanthin. These are carotenoid compounds, basically plant pigments, that have been shown in a University of Georgia study to boost the processing speed of your brain. I'm going to come back to those two carotenoids because they're found in some of the other foods that I'm going to mention as well, like eggs. When an embryo is developing, the first structure to assemble is the nervous system, which includes the brain. So an egg yolk literally has everything designed by nature to support an optimally developing brain. It's amazing. It's no wonder that egg yolks are considered nature's multivitamin by some. You want to eat the yolks, folks. The yolks are very healthy. They're very good for you. Grass-fed beef. Now this is very, I think, controversial because red meat, we're always told to limit our meat consumption. And I'm not a proponent of eating lots and lots of meat, but I definitely think that it should be incorporated into your diet. And this is in contrast to grain-fed factory farm meat. I am not endorsing that in any way, shape, or form, no way. But grass-fed organic beef is rich in a number of compounds that support brain energy metabolism. The fat of grass-fed beef is also very rich in those two carotenoids, lutein and zeaxanthin, which are not only good for your brain health, but your eye health and your skin health as well. Grass-fed beef has 3 times the vitamin E of grain-fed beef. Vitamin E, there's a strong relationship between the consumption of foods that contain vitamin E and better brain health. Why? Because vitamin E is a fat-soluble antioxidant. Again, it's a fat-soluble antioxidant. Why is this important to the brain? Because the brain is made of fat. And it's not just made of any type of fat. It's made of a fat that's very prone to oxidation, which is a process in the body that's sort of like accelerated aging. We want to consume more antioxidants, especially the fat-soluble ones. Wild salmon. Wild salmon is full of the building blocks that your brain requires to grow healthy new brain cells. Avocados. Avocados have a higher concentration of fat-protecting antioxidants than any other fruit or vegetable. They also have twice the potassium of a banana, which supports cardiovascular health, which is very important for brain health. And also a very good source of fiber, which is going to fill you up. Extra virgin olive oil. Extra virgin olive oil is actually a fruit juice that human beings have been pressing from olives for thousands of years. Unlike these newer industrial oils like canola oil, corn oil, and soybean oil, which I'm going to use the word toxic to describe, Extra virgin olive oil is actually quite healthy, and it's a staple of the Mediterranean dietary pattern, adherence to which is associated with a robust risk reduction for developing dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Mushrooms. Mushrooms are incredible. There's some really cool epidemiological research coming out of Asia where they're finding that people who consume mushrooms habitually have dramatically reduced risk of developing both dementia and a condition called mild cognitive impairment, which is sometimes referred to as pre-dementia. If you eat about a half a plate of mushrooms a week, they've found that over 6 years there's a 50% risk reduction for developing mild cognitive impairment, which correlation isn't causation, but empowering to know nonetheless. Cruciferous vegetables, like broccoli, kale, cabbage. These vegetables give your body the raw materials for your detox pathways. A lot of people are spending money these days on detox teas and the like. Cruciferous vegetables are the ultimate detoxification stimuli for the body. I'm going to try to rush through the next few slides because I've only got a few minutes left. We've got berries. I'm a huge fan of berries, blueberries in particular. The color in blueberries have been shown to accumulate in the hippocampus, which is the memory center of the brain, and protect it against oxidative stress and aging. People who consume more berries tend to have better memory function. Animal studies validate this fact. Dark chocolate. I usually get cheers from the audience. Cocoa flavanols, very beneficial, supportive of heart health. Again, habitual cocoa consumers tend to have better brain function, and there's even a correlational study that's found that countries where there's higher per capita chocolate consumption, they have higher numbers of Nobel laureates. So, it's a fact. Almonds. Again, a very important source of vitamin E and magnesium, which is important for DNA repair enzymes in the body. Nuts in general are important. You just want to make sure that they're either raw or dry roasted. Raw or dry roasted. Generally, if they're roasted but not dry roasted, that means that they're fried, usually in very unhealthy oils. Now, where's the hard data that all of these kinds of changes are going to actually minimize your risk for developing cognitive impairment? Well, I had the pleasure of going to Stockholm, Sweden, where I interviewed the lead researcher behind the finger study, which is some of the best evidence to date that our choices matter when it comes to our brain health. By adhering to a battery of these kinds of, a dietary pattern similar to the one that I've described, they found that in an older population of adults that were at risk for developing cognitive decline, that eating a healthy diet compared to the control group that was just given standard of care, they had an improvement in their brain's processing speed by 150% and an improvement in executive function by 83%. Or you guys live in Aspen, there's lots of great hikes. I live in Los Angeles. You know, we have the same. But I'm also a big fan of resistance training. And I like to talk about resistance training in particular because it's underappreciated in my view. Having stronger muscles is correlated to better brain health. We can see this in a number of studies that have come out recently. And not just brain health, but mental health. Published over the past year, we've had a number of really important and well-done meta-analyses that have found that not only is aerobic exercise critically important for treating depression, but resistance training, which I've highlighted in the bottom two, are critically important for a treatment for as a potential treatment for depression and anxiety. So, really, really critical stuff. Get to the gym. It's medicine for your brain. And in fact, exercise is now a new treatment guideline, according to the American Academy of Neurology, that a physician can write on a prescription pad to prescribe to patients with mild cognitive impairment. There's no other FDA-approved drug, as I sit here talking to you guys, for the treatment of mild cognitive impairment. So exercise, again, truly is medicine. Now, when I began my research, one of the most startling things that I've found, and I experienced in myself, is that, brain health is something that it's a huge knowledge gap for people. And I've sort of made it my mission to fill that gap. AARP performed a study where they found that, many people will concede brain health is critically important, but very few people actually know how to boost it. So I'm super excited that the Brain Institute is here, pivoting towards brain health. I think it's critically important. It's the most important conversation, I think, of our time. And a new dementia case is diagnosed every 3 seconds, which is startling.
Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
For this population, for people with celiac disease, for people with non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and also even for people with IBS, that the removal of gluten can lead to an improvement in mood symptoms.